The candle went out for the third time. In the darkness, 1,000 feet below Leadville, Colorado, a miner named Thomas McKenna stood perfectly still. Around him, the sounds of the chrysolite mine continued, distant picks striking rock, water dripping from timber supports, the creak of settling earth. His hands were steady as he relit the candle, but his mind was already made. 3 times, the rule was absolute. If your candle goes out 3 times for no reason, you go home, not because of bad air, not because of drafts or damp wicks, because it means your wife is being unfaithful. McKenna didn't speak to his foreman, didn't explain to the men working beside him. He simply walked toward the shaft, climbed into the cage, and rode to the surface. Then, he walked the 2 miles home in the middle of his shift, home at an hour when he should have been underground. He found his wife with another man. The violence that followed made the newspapers. 1 man dead, another wounded. And every miner in Leadville nodded knowingly when they heard the story the mountain had warned him. He'd listened, and he'd been right. This is the story of miner superstitions, not quaint folklore, but the invisible laws that governed life and death in the hard rock mines of the American frontier. Rules that miners followed more faithfully than any written regulation. Beliefs that shaped entire communities and lasted more than a century. Because in the mines of the 1880s, where death was random and control was an illusion, superstition was the only power a man had. Between 1877 and 1893, Leadville was the silver capital of America. The town exploded from a few hundred residents to over 30,000 in just 2 years. Miners poured in from across the world, drawn by stories of fortunes pulled from mountains that seemed to bleed silver. The Little Pittsburgh mine produced $80,000 worth of silver every single month. The chrysolite, the matchless, the Robert E. Lee. These mines made millionaires of men like Horace Tabor and Meyer Guggenheim. They built opera houses and Victorian mansions. They brought Oscar Wilde to lecture on Renaissance art to audiences of men who'd been underground 18 hours that same day. But for every millionaire created, there were 10,000 miners who worked for $2.50 to $3.50 per day. Men who descended into darkness at dawn and emerged, if they emerged, after sunset. Men who never saw daylight for weeks at a time during winter, men whose average age in the pauper section of Evergreen Cemetery was 22 years old. 22. The Irish immigrants who flooded into Leadville, nearly 1 in 4 miners by 1880, called the town a death trap. They'd fled starvation in Ireland only to find themselves breathing poisonous gases 1,000 feet underground, living in wooden shanties heated by a single stovepipe, watching their countrymen die of pneumonia at rates that shocked even hardened frontier doctors. And death was everywhere. Cave-ins, falling timbers, bad air that snuffed out candles and lungs with equal efficiency. Premature dynamite explosions, elevator cables that snapped, sending ore buckets and men plummeting 1,000 feet down vertical shafts, floods that filled drifts in minutes, methane explosions that traveled through miles of tunnels, killing men who never saw the spark that ended their lives. Mining was, by the 1880s, one of Colorado's most dangerous occupations. The state eventually enacted safety laws, requiring telephone connections to doctors by 1920, replacing candles with electric lighting in the 1880s. But technology couldn't eliminate the fundamental randomness of death underground. The miners had no control. They couldn't see the rock above them, couldn't predict when a timber would fail or when methane gas would seep into a drift. Couldn't know if today would be the day the mountain decided to kill them, so they created control through ritual, through superstition, through unwritten laws that gave them the illusion, the desperately necessary illusion, that they could influence their fate. The locker room was where the rituals began. Before a man could enter the cage that would lower him into the earth, he had to dress. And how he dressed could mean the difference between life and death, or so every miner believed. The superstition about new clothing ran deep. You didn't wear more than one new item at a time, ever. A new shirt was acceptable, new pants, fine. But both together? That was tempting fate in a way no sane man would risk. The belief was so strong that miners would deliberately seek out secondhand items. They'd pay extra for used dinner pails, reasoning that a pail that had made 100 trips underground and back was safer than one fresh from the store. Miners preferred secondhand lanterns and tools that had already been broken in by another man's hands. There was safety in things that had survived. If your coat fell off its hook while you were dressing, you went home. If your boots tumbled from the shelf, you walked away. If you put your shirt on inside out and then corrected it, you were finished for the day. Better to lose 8 hours of wages, a full day's pay of $3, than to risk your life on a bad omen. One miner, interviewed in the 1930s, remembered the day his partner's clothes fell off the rack. He stood there staring at that coat on the floor for maybe 2 minutes. Then he just walked out. Didn't say a word to anyone. Went home. The next day we had a cave-in in the very drift where he would have been working killed 2 men. My partner never came back to that mine. Was the superstition correct? Or had the miner simply gotten lucky? It didn't matter. The belief itself provided protection, psychological if not physical. And when you worked in an environment where death was random and meaningless, any sense of control was worth preserving. The rule about not returning to the locker room was equally absolute. Once you'd dressed and walked toward the shaft house, you couldn't turn back. If you'd forgotten something, it stayed forgotten. If you suddenly remembered you'd left your lunch pail sitting on the bench, you went hungry that day. The superstition had practical origins. A man who kept returning, who second-guessed himself, who showed hesitation, that man's mind wasn't focused, and an unfocused mind underground could kill you as surely as a rockfall. But over time, the practical became mystical. Miners believed that turning back literally invited disaster, that reversing your direction somehow reversed your luck, that the mountain noticed when you showed uncertainty and would punish you for it. And so, men descended into 1,000-foot shafts, having forgotten their lunch, their water, their spare candles, because the alternative was worse. One superintendent, writing in his journal in 1881, noted, "Lost 3 hours of production today when Williams turned back for his tobacco pouch. Entire crew refused to descend with him, sent him home." The superstition may be foolish, but a crew that doubts their luck is more dangerous than any gas. The most powerful superstition centered on the final shift. When a miner announced he was quitting, moving to a different mine, leaving Leadville, returning home to family, he created a problem. Because everyone absolutely knew, that accidents happened on the final shift. It was the most widely held belief in every mining district across the American West. The belief was so widespread, so deeply held, that it's documented in the records of the Leadville Herald from multiple decades. It is a matter of record, one article states, that many a man who was quitting his job would simply fail to show up for that announced last day. Wives would beg their husbands not to go, mothers would plead with sons, and the miners themselves, tough, practical men who'd spent years underground without incident, would wake up on their final day and simply not go. They'd forfeit the day's wages. They'd endure the mockery of their co-workers who called them cowards, but they'd still be alive. The psychology behind the superstition was complex. A man on his last day was already mentally gone. His mind was on whatever came next, a new job, a journey home, a reunion with family. He wasn't paying attention. And in a mine, a moment's inattention could mean death. But the superstition went deeper than that. There was a sense that announcing your departure somehow angered the mountain, that the mine itself felt betrayed by men who left and would strike them down before they could escape. Some miners found a workaround. They would quit without announcing it. They'd work their shift, collect their pay, and never come back. No announcement meant no final shift. No final shift meant no curse. One miner's widow, interviewed in 1945, told this story. "My husband worked the Robert E. Lee for 11 years. When he decided to quit, he didn't tell me until after. He just stopped going. Didn't even collect his last paycheck. I asked him why. He looked at me and said, 'That mine took my brother on a final shift. They found him crushed under a timber on his last day. I won't give that mountain the satisfaction of taking me too.'" Was there statistical evidence to support this superstition? The sources say it was a matter of record, but don't cite specific accident reports. What we do know is this: the belief was so strong that mines routinely lost workers who simply vanished rather than risk their last day. And sometimes, perhaps more often than chance would predict, men who ignored the superstition didn't come home. The candle superstitions operated on a different level entirely. In the depths of the mine, your candle was your life. Before the introduction of carbide lamps in the 1890s, miners worked by candlelight, a single tallow candle stuck to your hat with clay. That flickering flame showed you the rock face, the timber supports, the floor you walked on, the shaft you could fall into. But the candle also told you something more important: whether the air was safe to breathe. The rule was simple: if your candle goes out, you go out too. The practical wisdom was sound. Candles need oxygen. If your candle wouldn't stay lit, the air was bad, filled with methane or carbon dioxide or the dead air that accumulated in unventilated drifts. Men who ignored their dying candles simply stopped breathing, collapsed where they stood, died without a mark on them. But the superstition extended beyond this practical safety measure. If your candle went out 3 times in a row, not from bad air, but for no apparent reason, it meant something was wrong at home. Specifically, it meant your wife was being unfaithful. Some adventurer was after your wife, likely or not, and the mountain was warning you. When a man's candle extinguished 3 times, he would leave work immediately to investigate. Mine superintendents didn't stop him. Fellow workers didn't question him. The superstition was too strong, too universally accepted. And here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes the miners were right. One account from the 1880s tells of a miner whose candle went out 3 times in succession. On the 4th night, his candle went out yet again. This time, he didn't rationalize. He left the mine immediately and walked home unannounced. He found his wife with another man. The ensuing violence, one man killed, another wounded, made the newspapers. Did the candle really predict infidelity? Of course not. But did the miner notice something subconscious before descending into the mine? A tone in his wife's voice, a look in her eye. The candle gave him permission to acknowledge his suspicions, to confront a truth he might otherwise have ignored. The superstition served a psychological purpose. Whether it was true didn't matter. It provided a framework for men to acknowledge fears they couldn't otherwise express. Whistling underground was strictly forbidden. The chief reason, miners claimed, was that whistling set up vibrations that could cause the earth to move. Some miners believed whistling conjured evil spirits. Others insisted it dispelled them. But there was a practical reason beneath the superstition. One old-time miner explained, "Most of us wanted silence so we could listen for movements of the earth." You could hear a rock starting to shift. You could hear timbers beginning to crack. Those sounds gave you maybe 5 seconds of warning. 5 seconds to move, to run, to get out from under what was about to fall, but not if some fool was whistling Camptown races. Still, the superstition took on a life beyond the practical. Miners who whistled underground were ostracized, labeled as bad luck, blamed for any accident that occurred in the following days. In one documented case from 1881, a miner whistled in the Morning Star mine that afternoon. A cave-in killed 2 men in a different drift, hundreds of feet away. The whistler was beaten by his co-workers and run out of town. Not because he'd caused the cave-in, but because he'd violated the taboo. He'd invited disaster, and disaster had arrived. The superstition about women underground lasted longer than any other. Women were not allowed in mines, period. Their presence underground would cause disaster. Cave-ins, explosions, floods, death. This wasn't a casual belief. It was absolute. Miners would threaten to quit if a woman entered their workings. The superstition had tangled roots. Some claimed it dated back to ancient European mining folklore. Others said it originated from the belief that women were unclean during menstruation and would offend the spirits of the earth. Still others insisted it was simply bad luck, with no explanation needed. In 1879, the superintendent of Leadville's Morning Star mine made history by allowing his house guest, Mrs. Harry Marvin, to go underground. The July 26, 1879, Chronicle reported that Mrs. Marvin was the first lady to accomplish such a feat in Colorado. The miners were furious, terrified, convinced that catastrophe would follow. It didn't. The mine continued to operate. Production remained steady. No unusual accidents occurred. Soon after, other women visited the Morning Star, the Little Pittsburgh, and the New Discovery mines. Each visit was met with displeasure and fear. But slowly, very slowly, the superstition began to fade. Or did it? The belief persisted far longer than anyone expected. In 1972, nearly a century after Mrs. Marvin's historic descent, a woman was denied permission to go underground at the Straight Creek Tunnels project in Colorado, which would become the Eisenhower Tunnel. The underground workers, still believing women brought bad luck, threatened to walk off the job. The woman filed suit. Colorado had an equal rights law in the books. The case was settled quickly in her favor. That lawsuit in 1972 finally ended the legal prohibition on women working in Colorado mines. The superstition that had governed underground mining for centuries was broken by a civil rights lawsuit. But even after 1972, the belief lingered. Women who joined mining crews in the 1970s and 1980s reported that some older miners refused to work alongside them. Not out of sexism, or not only out of sexism, but out of genuine fear. These men had spent 50 years believing that women underground invited death. The truth about mining superstitions is this: they provided control in a world defined by its lack of control. You couldn't prevent a cave-in, but you could wear old boots. You couldn't predict bad air, but you could monitor your candle. You couldn't know when a timber would fail, but you could avoid working your final shift. You couldn't see into the earth above you, but you could listen for it, in silence, without whistling to mask its warnings. The superstitions were psychological armor. They transformed random death into something that felt, even slightly, manageable. If you followed the rules, performed the rituals, obeyed the taboos, then maybe you'd survive. And if you died? Well, you must have violated some superstition. Your death wasn't meaningless. It was your fault, your mistake, your broken rule. That was oddly comforting, because if death came from rule breaking, then others could avoid it by following the rules more carefully. The alternative, that death underground was arbitrary, random, utterly beyond anyone's control, was too terrifying to accept. So the miners created meaning, built structure, developed elaborate systems of belief that told them, you can survive this if you're careful, if you're vigilant, if you respect the mountain and follow its invisible laws. Modern mine safety professionals would recognize something familiar in these superstitions. Many had practical origins before becoming mystical. The refusal to work while distracted, the attention to environmental cues like candle flames, the emphasis on focusing your mind before entering danger. These weren't just folklore. They were survival strategies dressed in supernatural clothing. Today, Leadville sits at 10,152 feet above sea level, still the highest incorporated city in the United States. The mines are quiet now. The last major operation, the Climax molybdenum mine, collapsed in 1982 when the global molybdenum market crashed. The chrysolite mine, where men once refused to wear new boots, is sealed. The Morning Star, where Mrs. Marvin made history, is now part of the National Mining Museum. The Little Pittsburgh, which produced millions in silver, is a tourist attraction. You can tour some of the old mines, walk through the same drifts where miners once worked, stand in the changing rooms where men performed their private rituals before descending. And if you're quiet, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear them. The whispered prayers, the muttered charms, the unspoken rules that governed life at the edge of the earth's darkness. Because the superstitions weren't about the mountain at all. They were about the men, about their fear, their courage, their desperate need to believe they could control the uncontrollable, about the human instinct to create order from chaos, meaning from randomness, safety from ritual. For the miners of Leadville, of Cripple Creek, of 1,000 other camps across the American West, these superstitions were more than folklore. They were how you survived, how you descended into the earth each morning and convinced yourself you might emerge that night, how you faced your final shift or avoided it when the time came. They were the invisible rules that governed the visible world, the unwritten laws more powerful than any regulation a mine company could post. And in the darkness, 10,000 feet above sea level and 1,000 feet below the earth's surface, they were all a man had.